Hello folks, today I'll show you how to migrate your AWS cost and usage report from CUR 1.0 to CUR 2.0 in Harness CACM. The newer format brings several improvements, including better support for granular cost data, resource level visibility, split cost allocation, reservation-related data, and newer cost management use cases. So, if you are still using the legacy CUR 1.0 format with Harness CACM, it is a good idea to upgrade. The overall migration process is quite straightforward, but there are a few important configuration options that you need to select correctly. Let's get started. First, go to Account Settings in Harness and check which version your AWS billing connector is currently using. In my case, you can see that the connector is configured with CUR 1.0, which is the legacy format. Before changing anything in Harness, we first need to create the new export on the AWS side. So, let's go to the AWS console, navigate to Billing and Cost Management, and then go to Data Exports. Here we can see the existing billing exports. In this example, the existing reports are still using the legacy format. Now let's create a new data export and select CUR 2.0 as the export type. Give a report name. This next step is very important. While creating the export, make sure you select the required options so that Harness receives the granular data needed for cost analysis. First, enable Include Resource IDs. This allows the report to include resource level information and gives us more granular cost visibility. Next, enable split cost allocation data. This is important for detailed allocation data, especially for shared or containerized workloads. Then, enable include caller identity, or IAM principal allocation data. This provides additional information about the IAM principal associated with the usage. And finally, enable include capacity reservation columns and granularity. This ensures that the report contains the required capacity reservation details at the appropriate level of granularity. So, just to call this out clearly, make sure these four options are enabled. Include resource IDs split cost allocation data, include caller identity or IAM principal allocation data, and include capacity reservation columns and granularity. If these options are not enabled, the report may not contain the level of granular data required for the full CACM experience. Next, select hourly time granularity. Then select Parquet as the file format. There is one more important setting here. For the report file delivery option, select Overwrite existing data report file instead of Create new data report file. Using the Overwrite option keeps the export structure consistent and avoids generating a new set of report files every time AWS refreshes the data. So make sure Overwrite existing data report file is selected before you continue. Now, there's another important recommendation. Create a new and dedicated S3 bucket for this export, instead of reusing the bucket that is currently being used by the legacy report. Keeping the old and new exports in separate buckets makes the migration much cleaner. It also avoids mixing two different report formats and makes troubleshooting much easier if you ever need to compare the old and new data. So, create a new S3 bucket specifically for this export and configure that as the destination. Once everything looks correct, review the configuration and create the export. Now, after creating it, do not expect the report files to appear in the S3 bucket immediately. AWS can take around 24 hours to generate the first report. So, I recommend waiting for approximately 24 to 48 hours and then coming back to verify that the report has actually been generated in the new S3 bucket. This is an important validation step before making any changes to the Harness connector. Once the report is available, verify that the expected files are being generated correctly in the new bucket. Next, we also need to validate the IAM role that Harness uses for the CACM connector. The role must have all the required permissions to access the new export and the new S3 bucket. Make sure the role has the necessary S3 permissions for the new bucket, as well as any additional permissions required for the integration. Do not assume that the permissions used for the legacy report will automatically cover the new configuration. This is especially important because we have created a new S3 bucket. The IAM role must have access to that new bucket. In my case, the required permissions are already configured, so I don't need to make any changes. But if any permissions are missing, follow the Harness documentation and update the IAM role before proceeding. You can update the permissions manually, or if needed, you can also run the provided CloudFormation template to create or update the required IAM permissions. Once the permissions are updated, validate that the Harness IAM role can successfully access the new S3 bucket and the billing export. Even if AWS generates the report successfully, Harness will not be able to ingest the data if the IAM role does not have the required access. Once the report has been generated and the permissions have been validated, we can move back to Harness. Open the AWS billing connector that you want to migrate and click Edit. Here, change the version from CUR 1.0 to CUR 2.0. Then update the connector with the new export name and the new S3 bucket we created. Review the configuration carefully, make sure the export name is correct, make sure the new S3 bucket is correct, and make sure the IAM role has all the required permissions. Then save the connector and run the connection test. If the report is already available and the permissions are correct, the connector validation should succeed. Once the connector is updated and the data starts flowing, verify the ingestion in Harness to make sure everything is working as expected. And as you can see here, the migration is now complete. The key things to remember are: enable all the required granular data options, select overwrite existing data report file, use a new dedicated S3 bucket, wait around 24 hours for AWS to generate the first report, validate the IAM permissions, and only then update the Harness connector. That's it. Thanks for watching.